Okay, so chapter 19 is looking at America's involvement in the First World War. A couple of things to note before getting into this. First is that the causes of World War I had nothing to do with the United States. And in fact, we don't join in the war, we don't enter the war until 2 years after it started. Secondly, our role in this war, though helpful for the Allies, will be nowhere near as consequential as the role that America will play in World War II. And then finally, World War I marks an important turning point for the United States internationally in the sense that this is really the point at which the United States becomes a world power and also throws its weight around on the world stage. In this case, by actually entering a war. Now, there'll be some backlash to this in the 1920s and some policies of isolationism, but really by this point the die is kind of cast. We've already staked our claim as a world power. We are fundamentally involved in global events after this, whether we want to be or not. Question one, in what ways did the progressive presidents promote the expansion of American power overseas? So progressive presidents, Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, all expanded the role of the United States in international affairs. This is mostly in the Western Hemisphere. Keep in mind the Monroe Doctrine really kind of says that the Western Hemisphere is the United States to guide. Uh, but the intent of this was to ensure receptive environments for U.S. manufactured goods, again, mostly in the Western Hemisphere, parts of Latin America. One example of this is the Panama Canal. In this case, Teddy Roosevelt engineered an uprising in Colombia in order to create an independent Panama, which then subsequently sold us the land to build the canal. But in doing so, we are going to reduce East Coast, West Coast travel by about 8,000 miles, which is good economically. And also from a kind of military standpoint, it gives the United States control over a very important waterway and trading route. Also, in regards to Roosevelt's administration, Roosevelt initiates the policy that comes to be known as the Roosevelt Corollary. And this is really kind of an addition or amendment to the Monroe Doctrine. The Roosevelt Corollary says that the United States would act as a kind of international police power in the Western Hemisphere. The intent here is to collect debts from Latin American countries that are owed to European nations. We don't want European nations coming into the Western Hemisphere to collect those debts by force, so we say we will do it on their behalf. And in doing so, we expand our role internationally, we expand our role in the Western Hemisphere, but still maintain our kind of exclusive control over it as we see it via the Monroe Doctrine. After Roosevelt, we have William Howard Taft, and his general approach to international foreign policy is that of dollar diplomacy. Dollar diplomacy implies use, or rather the use of economic investments rather than military force to bolster U.S. foreign policy in parts of Asia and Latin America. It's generally regarded at the time as being ineffective and will be subsequently abandoned by later presidents who favor the more traditional military style approach. One of those would be our third progressive president and president during World War I, Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson's strategy here is what he refers to as moral imperialism. Wilson thought that expanding U.S. economic interests overseas would also help to spread American values of democracy and equality and so on. And case in point here, Wilson tries to intervene and to control the course of the Mexican Revolution along our southern border in 1913. Doesn't have a lot of success there, but it does indicate that Wilson is willing to get U.S. forces involved and to exert U.S. influence in foreign powers in order to try to spread what he believes to be American values. Number two, how did the United States get involved in World War I? So the war actually began in 1914 and lasted until 1918. If you remember back to your world history classes, there were a complex combination of things like military alliances, rivalries between competing empires, the rise of nationalism, and ultimately the assassination of an Austro-Hungarian Archduke, Franz Ferdinand. And all this together causes the war. And the two sides, generally speaking, are the Allies, which is Britain, France, and Russia. Britain is really the most important one there. And then on the other side, you have the Central Powers, which is Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. And here, Germany is the principal participant here. So really, the heart of the conflict is between Britain and Germany with their allies. Now, at first, Americans are very divided over the war. Some supported intervention, others supported neutrality, and immigrants oftentimes supported their country of origin, be it Germany, Russia, Austria-Hungary, or whoever. The United States had a competing relationship with Britain and Germany. They were both trading partners, but Wilson personally believed that Germany was an enemy of democracy and he was more supportive of the British than the Germans. Now, Wilson will declare neutrality for the United States when war breaks out in 1914, but naval blockades between the British and the Germans put this to the test. And in that regard, it very much resembles our concern over freedom of the seas during the War of 1812. Remember, we're trying to trade with both Britain and France. Both are blockading one another, and as we see it at the time, they're both violating our sovereignty and freedom of the seas. Something similar is happening here, especially the use of German U-boats or submarines to sink merchant vessels, including neutral American vessels. It's going to be the sinking of the passenger liner Lusitania in 1915 that will kill 128 Americans that are on board and is going to bring us very close to war with Germany. Now, while Wilson had declared neutrality and resisted getting involved in the war, and in fact, he campaigned for re-election on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," Wilson finds himself in a position that where it appears that war is coming, that the German blockade and the sinking of the passenger liner Lusitania as well as merchant ships is going to bring us in the war. So Wilson begins to pursue a policy called preparedness. This preparedness is a program to expand the Army and Navy in preparation for our involvement in the war if that happens. Now, the sinking of the Lusitania does not actually lead the United States to declare war. Instead, it's going to be nearly a year later when the United States intercepts the so-called Zimmermann Note or Zimmermann Telegram. Here, Germany had sent a telegram to Mexico, encouraging them to declare war on the United States, to distract us and keep us out of Europe. And in exchange, once the war was over with, Germany, in the resulting treaty, would make sure that Mexico had essentially the Mexican cession returned to it. Remember, the Mexican cession was essentially the American Southwest, and it was lost to Mexico to the United States in the Mexican-American War when we signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. This Zimmermann Note or Zimmermann Telegram is intercepted by the British. It's given to the United States, and that is going to be our cause for war. Wilson will ask Congress for a declaration of war. And in that declaration, or rather in this speech, he's going to proclaim that the world must be made safe for democracy. And in doing that, he begins this by casting the war as one about freedom and democracy, a challenge of competing ideological systems. This isn't simply a war about trade or anything like it. Rather, it's a war to protect the ideological system of democracy. So a good way to remember the causes of America's involvement in the war are going to be the boat and the note. So the boat is the Lusitania, the note is the Zimmermann Telegram. Easy enough to remember. And declaring war here, by the way, also breaks with our tradition of non-involvement in European affairs that goes all the way back to Washington's farewell address, in which he encouraged, rather he discouraged the creation of political parties and entangling alliances with foreign powers particularly European ones. So again, Wilson said the world must be made safe for democracy. Its peace must be planted upon the tested foundations of political liberty. We have no selfish ends to serve. We desire no conquest, no dominion. We seek no indemnities for ourselves, no material compensation for the sacrifices we shall freely make. We are but one of the champions of the rights of mankind. We shall be satisfied when those rights have been made as secure as the faith and the freedom of nations can make them. Wilson will put together a plan for our involvement in the war. These will come to be known as Wilson's 14 points. They not only state America's war aims or our goals in the war, but also a vision for a post war peace in which these 14 points would establish rules that would prevent wars in the future, including things like allowing nations self determination to choose their own form of government. It included freedom of the seas, free trade, and importantly, he proposed the creation of a League of Nations, or a large diplomatic body that had representatives from all countries, where nations could come together and settle their differences diplomatically through discussion, debate, and negotiation, rather than trying to settle their differences militarily. These 14 points are going to be important later on, and they will come into play once the war is over with and the peace treaty is being written by the victorious Allied powers, of which the United States is a part. Now, like I said at the beginning, our involvement in this war is not nearly as consequential as our involvement will be in World War II. So, the American Expeditionary Force, as it was called, played a pretty limited role in the war, but it did help to hasten its end. Really, the most important contributions from the US were not military in nature, but rather uh, food, supplies, fuel, and especially money. We go from being a nation in debt to a nation that, or well, we're still in debt, but a lot of European nations are indebted to the United States significantly after the war because we've loaned so much money out in order to end the war. What's most important for the AP exam is not what's going on overseas, but rather what's going on at home during the war. Because World War I is really kind of characterized at home by a kind of fanatical nationalism, this sort of fanatic patriotism and support of the war. Something that gets so bad in some regards that the government in World War II actively tries to prevent the same kind of thing from happening again in terms of whipping up too much radical and fanatical support. Um, but three, how did the United States mobilize resources and public opinion for the war effort? Progressives generally supported Wilson and the war as an opportunity to create a larger federal government, not only to wage the war, but also to institute social reforms. And World War I is really kind of the last of the progressive era, but there are some significant gains made from the progressive point of view during this war because it offers such an opportunity. So the war is going to lead to a pretty dramatic expansion of the federal government, similar to what happened during the Civil War and what will happen again during World War II. One example of this expansion is the Selective Service Act in 1917 institutes a new draft or conscription to build up the military in preparation for war. Dramatically, we have the War Industries Board, also created in 1917, created a federal agency whose job it was to regulate the economy for war production. And this is really remarkable because this shifts away from generally, government non-intervention in the economy to really extreme control of the economy by the American government with the goal of producing for the war. So this is a pretty radical departure for government economic policy during the war. We also had the creation of the Food Administration, which managed farm production and ensured rationing for people back home and encouraged people to plant victory gardens so that they could produce their own food. That way, there's more to go around for troops overseas. Now, importantly, and definitely tying into that fanatical nationalism in support of the war that we see, is the federal agency that's created called the Committee on Public Information. The Committee on Public Information is created in 1917, and it used propaganda to generate support for the war. Now, there were plenty of people that were against the war, especially within the labor movement. So some, like members of the International Workers of the World and the Socialist Party, opposed the war. They claimed it was started by capitalist elites but fought by working men, and it was truly a distraction from the very real concerns of the labor movement back home. So the government saw the necessity to sell the war to Americans, and it's going to be the Committee on Public Information whose job it is to do that. They're our propaganda ministry, really, during the war. It's going to be led by George Creel. Sometimes you'll see the CPI called the Creel Committee. But the Committee on Public Information used pamphlets, posters, speeches by so-called Minutemen who would give these 1-minute speeches to try to promote the war or the selling of war bonds. And they portrayed the war as a war for democracy both abroad and at home. And they painted the Germans as these monsters, these kind of barbaric Huns that we needed to defend ourselves and, in fact, the rest of the world against. Now, the CPI selling this war as one for democracy, including a fight for democracy at home, this is going to have the interesting effect of promoting the women, helping to bolster the women's suffrage movement. And during the war, we will have the emergence of a new suffrage organization called the National Women's Party, which is led by a reformer named Alice Paul. Alice Paul had gone to university in Britain, and while she was over there, she had become familiar with the more militant tactics of British suffragettes, who tended to be a lot more confrontational than Americans, including hunger strikes, throwing rocks, beating up police officers, and crazy stuff. And she brings a lot of those confrontational tactics back to the United States with her. And she will actually protest the president and protest in favor of women's suffrage during the war, which was seen as very taboo at the time. So she'll compare Wilson to the Kaiser, Kaiser of Germany, saying that he's undemocratic because he's not supporting women's suffrage. She and others will chain themselves to the White House fence. When they're arrested for obstructing traffic, she'll conduct a pretty well publicized hunger strike in the prison. And Paul's organizing the political pressure she puts on Wilson, along with women's patriotic support during the war by, taking over jobs that men had vacated to go fight overseas. This is going to lead Wilson to express support for the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, which will allow women the right to vote nationally. Now, the president has nothing to do with amendments in terms of he doesn't sign them or vote on them or anything like that, but his expression of public support went a long way to get more political support so that this amendment could actually pass and be added to the Constitution. Also during the war, we have the emergence of prohibition, which is passed by the 18th Amendment to the Constitution. The idea behind prohibition, or making it illegal or making the manufacture, sale, or transportation of alcohol illegal, was many-fold. Prohibition advocates believed that it could create a more disciplined workforce, that it could prevent domestic violence. They targeted immigrants by saying that prohibition could help promote American values to immigrants. And usefully during the war, it could be used as a way to attack German American breweries. It could save grain as part of rationing for the war effort. So prohibition served some war purposes, but is also a culmination of one of the progressive reform movements, and even going so far back as to the temperance movement in the antebellum or pre-Civil War period. Next, maybe predictably, civil liberties were restrained during the war, much as they had been during the Civil War. So in 1917, Congress passes the Espionage Act, which prohibited spying and also interfering with the draft. And this ends up being upheld by a Supreme Court case called Schenck v. U.S. So a socialist by the last name of Schenck was arrested for distributing flyers that encourage men not to report if they were drafted and not to register for the draft. He said that you can't arrest me for this. This is a violation of my freedom of speech. I can say this if I want to. Um, in the Supreme Court case Schenck v. U.S., the court actually ruled that his arrest was legal because the kind of speech he was using was not protected, because that speech represented a clear and present danger to the United States. So, by that logic and that justification, the Espionage Act will also be used to arrest and convict socialist leader Eugene V. Debs for an anti-war speech that he gave. And he will actually manage to run for president from jail in 1920, interestingly enough. The other law that's passed that's a restriction of civil liberties is the Sedition Act in 1918. And this effectively prohibited criticism of the government and is also basically upheld by Schenck v. U.S. at the time. Next, the Justice Department and an organization calling themselves the American Protective League persecuted political radicals as un-American. The American Protective League was more or less a vigilante group that was endorsed by the U.S. Justice Department, but they targeted socialists, communists, members of the IWW, labor leaders, etc. In a famous incident in 1917 called the Bisbee deportation, the American Protective League rounded up about 1,300 suspected radicals and sent them by train out of Arizona to a small desert town in New Mexico. Effectively, they just kidnapped 1,300 people for holding different political views, put them on a train, and then just dropped them in the middle of the desert. These kinds of activities are actually going to continue even after the war during a paranoid period referred to as the Red Scare, which we'll come back to in a later question. Fourth, how did the war affect race relations in the United States? So America's diversity, mostly due to immigration, had become a growing concern or a growing subject of public concern for some time. So-called Americanization during the war promoted assimilation of immigrants through work, schools, and so on. Nonetheless, it's during World War I that Congress begins to consider the use of immigration restrictions to cut down on the flow of new immigrants coming into the United States. Those immigrants that were already here, namely German American ones, were targeted for discrimination and even violence during the war. And as noted earlier, prohibition is seen as a useful tool to attack German American breweries. In the Southwest, Mexican immigration will increase due to the demand for wartime labor, but once here and working mostly in agricultural fields, they face discrimination, segregation, unfair pay, that kind of thing. We already know that progressives were generally indifferent to the plight of African Americans in the Jim Crow South. As a result, segregation, disenfranchisement, lynching were all still common and persistent during the war. I mean, Wilson himself held some pretty racist views. And that's illustrated by a number of things, including allowing for the film The Birth of a Nation to premiere at the White House in 1915. Birth of a Nation was the first, blockbuster movie in U.S. history. We'll talk about it a little more during the 1920s. But it glorifies the Ku Klux Klan, and it's actually going to lead to a resurgence in their membership that's going to last through the 1920s. Another example of Wilson's racism is that he tried to segregate the federal workforce, which had not previously been segregated, and when that was protested by black federal employees, he simply fired African American federal employees in mass. W.E.B. Du Bois is again a progressive reformer, or is included among the progressive reformers, and we've talked about him in comparison with Booker T. Washington in the past. We know that Du Bois advocated for immediate equal rights of African Americans rather than the kind of gradualism favored by Booker T. Washington. Du Bois was a founding member of the NAACP in 1909, who often employed legal strategies in the fight for civil rights and published the monthly magazine called The Crisis. Du Bois advocated for intellectual development and broad education rather than the more vocational education advocated by Booker T. Washington. Importantly, during the war, we see a pretty dramatic population shift for African Americans, and this is called the Great Migration. So the Great Migration saw many African Americans flee the South for work in wartime industries in the North and Midwest. Even though we have hundreds of thousands of people leaving during the war and into the 1920s, even after that, still over 90% of African Americans lived in the American South. And that's true all the way up through the 1960s. So, despite the dramatic migration of African Americans out of the South, the population center nationwide for African Americans still remains the American South. Nonetheless, the sudden rise in African American populations in northern and midwestern cities set off violence, including a race riot in Chicago in 1919 that lasted for 5 days and resulted in 38 deaths. And it was not an isolated incident. In fact, the Chicago race riot in 1919 was part of a larger wave of Great Migration riots that occur in 25 cities in the summer of 1919, which is referred to as the Red Summer. The Great Migration is going to continue into the 1920s, even as immigration restrictions go into effect, and that's going to create a demand for cheap labor, which will continue to draw African Americans northward. And many of those African Americans who are settling in the North are becoming familiar with a new African American intellectual voice in the form of Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey offers a new vision of Black freedom. He's the head of the UNIA, which is the Universal Negro Improvement Association. And Garvey and the UNIA were committed to the ideas of global African solidarity, or Pan-Africanism, as it's sometimes called. They promoted the beauty of dark skin. They promoted African American culture. They promoted African self-determination. Essentially, this is the birth of Black nationalism in the United States as part of a larger international movement led by Garvey. He's probably best known, though, for advocating that Africans or people of African heritage throughout the world, not just in the United States, actually migrate to Africa in order to found a strong nationalist African state on par with nationalist states, say, in Europe or the United States in particular. Um, he will be jailed for some trumped up charge like mail fraud or something like that during the 1920s. But Garvey's Black nationalism and his message of pride in African American identity is going to be important in bolstering other movements like in the 20s, the Harlem Renaissance. It's going to be crucial in influencing other organizations and other civil rights leaders like Malcolm X or Stokely Carmichael in the 1960s, in the 1960s. So Garvey is an often overlooked and not very well-known figure in American history, but he's crucially important. And I would expect to see questions about Garvey on the APUSH test before you would see questions on someone they know that you know, like Martin Luther King Jr. Finally, 5, why was 1919 such a watershed or important year for the United States and for the world? So first, the Russian Revolution had created the Soviet Union, which is the first communist state. And the United States and other allies saw it as a dire threat to both capitalism and even perhaps democracy. 1919 also sees a worldwide flu epidemic called the Spanish flu that'll kill 20 to 40 million people globally, including 700,000 people in the United States. 1919 will also see widespread post-war strikes in the United States. And this, in combination with fear of a communist revolution here, like the one that happened in Russia, is going to lead to a period called the Red Scare. So the Red Scare, again, of 1919-1920, connected these post-war strikes with the Bolshevik Revolution that creates the Soviet Union. There is fear, probably irrational and unfounded fear, that these strikes were the first salvos in a communist revolution in the United States. And the government reacts to this very forcefully, ultimately tamping down on radicalism throughout the United States with consequences for years to come. Part of this are the so-called Palmer raids. So the Palmer raids were searches conducted by the Justice Department, led by Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, hence the Palmer raids. The Palmer raids targeted suspected communists, anarchists, and other political radicals, and in doing so, they violated basic civil liberties. They conducted warrantless searches of homes and organizations' offices. They detained a lot of these radicals without access to a lawyer, and in some cases, they even deported some of these individuals without due process or, a charge of a crime or trial, as is supposed to be necessary for a deportation. The effect of the Red Scare, the Palmer raids, the American Protective League that we mentioned earlier is going to be that the IWW, or the International Workers of the World, as well as the American Socialist Party, are effectively destroyed during this period and will no longer be major influences in American politics or even really within the labor movement at that point. Now, with the war over, 1919 also sees the Paris Peace Conference, which not only ended the war with the treaty, but also established a new global order in the aftermath of World War I. Although colonized people took Wilson's idea of self-determination pretty seriously, and they called for independence, the other allies really did not. So the Treaty of Versailles, which ends the war, even though Wilson tries to have his 14 points included, he's generally ignored, and 13 of the 14 points don't make their way into the Treaty of Versailles. The one that does, however, is the League of Nations. So the Treaty of Versailles will establish a League of Nations. However, the United States is never going to join it. In fact, the United States never even signs the Treaty of Versailles to end World War I. We actually have to conclude a completely separate treaty with Germany to end our involvement. This is because there were opponents to the treaty and to the League of Nations in the Senate. These opponents were called irreconcilables, and they were led by a political rival of Wilson's named Senator Henry Cabot Lodge. These irreconcilables, led by Lodge, and many other Americans besides, believed that joining the League of Nations would lead the United States into further involvement in foreign wars. That had been such a break with American tradition, and already enough Americans see our involvement in World War I as a mistake, and they want to prevent this from happening in the future, which is why they oppose the League of Nations. Wilson might have had a better chance of getting this pushed through the Senate had he not had a stroke upon his return to the United States, which really made it, well, pretty much impossible for him to successfully negotiate its passage. But our next president after Wilson is going to be a Republican named Warren G. Harding. He'll be elected in 1920, and he's going to promise a return to normalcy. This return to normalcy implies that Americans will now reject the progressivism and reject the internationalism of the last 10 years or so. It's an acknowledgement, certainly by his election, by many Americans, that things have changed too much too quickly. With progressivism in World War I, America has been fundamentally reshaped in a very short period of time. We need to return to a status quo. We need a return to normalcy, as Warren G. Harding promises, and we'll get that. And as a result, the progressive era effectively ends, and the 1920s, as we'll see in the next chapter, will be a pretty conservative decade by comparison.